Good evening. Hope all of you are doing well. Tonight we're learning Maseches Rosh Hashana Daf Chav Gimel. We're starting at a new Mishnah and a famous Mishnah. At the bottom of Chav Beis and Beis, we are all familiar that when it was Rosh Chodesh, that the initial model of sharing that information was mountaintop to mountaintop. They'd light fires. They'd do this type of light show with, as we'll soon see, with wood and whatever it was. So we'll see what that is now. But this is a very, very well-known Mishnah. And it was not only well-known in that the Mishnah indicates how they used to transfer this information by using fire. The speed of light is pretty quick, and you can get from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, as we will soon see, in just a matter of minutes. It wasn't that far. And we know how far apart each of the mountains were. We know how far it was from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael. It didn't take long at all. However, we also know that there were other types of Jews at that time, some of whom were not on the same page as those of us who are in this room. We believe in Torah Sheba'al Peh. That's what we're learning, is Torah Sheba'al Peh. So we believe in that, and they were halachically and hashkafically way off the derech in that regard. So let's get started with this very well-known Mishnah, Chav Beis Amid Beis, about 15 lines from the bottom, a new Mishnah. The Mishnah writes, Barishona initially, hayu masiin masuos. What is masiin masuos? The language. That's not a language of fire. So we'll have to see what that means in the Gemara. We know what it means, that they would have torches. Mevian klunsos shel erez haruch, and they'd bring long pieces of wood that were cedar. The kanim, other pieces of wood, va'atzei shemen and olive wood, unu'ura shel pishtan, and strips of flax. The korech b'meshicha, they'd wrap them around the wood. Ve'ola l'rosh hahar, they'd go up to the top of the mountain. Not any mountain, but a specific mountain. And then umatis b'ana sa'ur, they would light it on fire. Umolich umevi umale umorid, they would bring the fire back and forth and up and down, making, again, was from the Mishnah, it's not clear, were they making particular shapes? So says the Gemara, ad shehu roes chavero shu osakein barosh hahar hasheni v'chein barosh hahar hashlishi. So first would lead to second, and second to third, v'chule, and that's how everything, that's how the word would travel. Where would they start? So says the Gemara, says the Mishnah very clearly. We're 10 lines or so from the bottom of Chav Beis Mid Beis in the Mishnah, and the Mishnah writes, Mehar HaMishcha l'Sartava. They start by Har HaMishcha within Yerushalayim, and then they would go to another mountain called Sartava. Misartava leGrupina, umiGrupina leChavrin, umichavrin leBeis Belatin, umiBeis Belatin lo zazu misham elamoluch umevi malamordat shahayaroa kol hagola lefanav kimduras eish. He would stand there on that last mountain. So you've got a whole bunch of them. Mehar HaMishcha to Sartiva, that's 2. Sartiva to Grupina, Grupina to Chavrin, Chavrin Beis Belatin to whatever was on the other side of that, and we'll see soon in the Gemara what that is. Says the Gemara, the first question that I was hinting to already, my mashma de masian lishna de yikudhu. How do we know that the language in the Mishnah of masian masuas is a language of fire? That's not how we say fire. There's a whole bunch of ways to say fire. That's not it. It says the Gemara 4 lines from the bottom, 5 lines from the bottom. It says the Gemara, Dichsi vayisaim David va'anashav. What does it mean vayisaim? Umetargeminan. The way that we interpret this word masian in Aramaic is ve'okdinan, and therefore we can see that okdinan in Aramaic, which means to burn. So that's where we see that the word masian has an affiliation to the word of burning, and that's why it's used this way. Next, 4 lines from the bottom, Tanu Rabbanan. Ein masian masuos ela la chodesh shenir bizmano lekacha. The only time that we do the fires is in a short month. Shenir bizmano lekacha, when it's only in its right time. And this, again, the Rishonim deal with the language here that it's 20 on the 29th day, that it's a month of 29 days and not 30 days. When do they do the actual masin of the masuas l'or avuro? At the end of that day. The Mefarshim say it's at the end of the 30th day, indicating that in fact that day was Rosh Chodesh. The previous day was Rosh Chodesh. So says the Gemara L'Meimra, this seems to imply from this brisa, it seems that the only time that they would light the fires of Masi and Masuos of our Mishnah was De'achaser Avdinan, only when the month was a chaser, when the month was 29 days, the 30th day being Rosh Chodesh. But Amale, if it were to have been a 30-day month, and then only the 31st day from the previous Rosh Chodesh would have been the day of Rosh Chodesh, then Lo Avdin in my time. Well, what's the reason why we only would be Masi and Masuas for a 29-day month and not for a 30-day month? So Amar Reb Zera, the reason why 2 lines from the bottom was because Gzeru Mishu Rosh Chodesh Chaser, Shechalios Be'erev Shabbos. If you have a Rosh Chodesh Chaser, so Rosh Chodesh Chaser was the 29th was the 29th day, which was a Friday. So what they then would have done was they would have had to light a fire on Shabbos, but they couldn't. So when would we have had to do? We would have had to have done it on Motzei Shabbos. It says the Gemara, if we would have assumed that Masi and Masuos was also done in a month that had 30 days, and really Rosh Chodesh would have been on the 31st day. So then says the Gemara, Asu lemite, top of Chav Gimel Amad Aleph, then there would have been an error. What might the error have been? Says the Gemara on the top of Chav Gimel Amre, one might have said, Hi Chaser, who really, the month is 29 days. V'hai delo avid me esmo. The reason why they didn't light the fire the night before is Mishum delo efshar. Because they couldn't, because it was Shabbos, and they would have made an error. Oh, Dilma, or perhaps Malehu Uvizmano Ado. Really, it is Male, it is a regular month, because they couldn't do it on Shabbos, they pushed off. So because they couldn't do it on Shabbos, and someone might think that it's Male. So therefore, they made a rule, we're never going to do it on a Male, because of that case where Rosh Chodesh falls out on Erev Shabbos, and therefore there couldn't be that confusion of what how many days are in that month. The only time we are ever Masi and Masuos is when the month has 29 days. Says the Gemara, why not solve it in the following way? 3 lines down. Why don't we say that a person should do the Masi and Masuos, or I should say the Bezdin should be Masi and Masuos, whether or not it's Malay or Chaser. Rosh Chodesh be'erev Shabbos. And in that case that you are so concerned about, where Rosh Chodesh falls out on Erev Shabbos, lo le'avid klal. Don't do anything on those months, and then everyone will know. We have a way of solving this. Do always Malay and Chaser. But on the month, when Shabbos, when Rosh Chodesh falls out on Erev Shabbos, don't do any Masi and Masuos. And by definition, everyone could do the math and figure out what's going on. Says the Gemara, Afilu hachi, even in that case, there could have been an error. Afilu hachi asu limite, amre, Hi Malay, who really one could have argued that it is Malay, V'hai delo avde, and the reason why they were not Masi and Masuos was because Isnuse hu de Isnuse. He was an Anus. What kind of ones is this? So says Rashi, very interesting Rashi. Where's Rashi? Rashi is the 5th line of the page. He overdrank at Kiddush on Shabbos. So that's what the Gemara says is very problematic. So that's what the Gemara says, that we were afraid that there might have been some type of error in decision making. What's that?
It's not new.
It is not new. It is not new. So much so that it wove itself into the Gemara. Though in 2,000 years, we should have improved a little bit. I think we've regressed over the last little while. Anyways, what? That's always been bad. Yeah, it's always been bad. So anyways, that's what the Gemara says, is this couldn't be a solution of always doing the Masi and Masuos both by Mole and Chaser, because we would have had the same concerns of making a mistake. Says the Gemara, fine. Another solution is that maybe we could only do Masi and Masuos on a Mole instead of a Chaser, unlike Reb Zera's recommendation on the bottom of the page. So maybe we should only do it on Mole and not on a Chaser month, only when the month is 30 days and not 29. Amar Abai, nope, not happening. Mishum Bizel Malacha La'am. Shnei Yamim. Not going to happen, because then people would have been Mavatal 2 days of Rosh Hashana. Now, obviously, this is before we made the distinction that we should always have 2 days of Rosh Hashana. Prior to that time, Rosh Hashana was only 1 day, but now you have 2 days of Bittul Malacha, and people were living hand to mouth. They weren't getting paychecks every 2 weeks. They got paid at the end of the workday. And that was the din. Actually, we have halacha of making sure that lo salim pula sachir. We have to make sure that we pay our workers on time. That's a mitzvah d'oraisa. We have an obligation to pay within our contract terms. If there are no contract terms, you should pay them right away. That's the din. So let's say you have someone working at your house and they're like a laborer. They're only getting paid hourly. So halacha l'maisa, you really should be paying them right away. That's appropriate. And that brings us to the 2 dots, 10 lines down. We said that they bring cedar wood, maybe klunsos, these types of cedar wood. The next 15, 20 lines is all about cedar wood. I am not a botanist. I'm just going to tell you what types of trees. My father's also not a botanist, but he could probably build a botanist. He could probably make one from scratch. So says the Gemara that we know that it was made from cedar. So says the Gemara, Amar Yehuda Dalid Minei Rosenheim. There are 4 types of cedar. We'll soon see that the word cedar here is used loosely, and it probably means wood in general. But that's what they refer to here in the Gemara as cedar, because as we'll see, a lot of these trees were not cedar trees. Says the Gemara, Erez Kasrum, it's Shemen Uvrosh. What are all 4 of these types of wood? Kasrum Amar Rav Idra. It's a type of tree called an Idra. We saw this word somewhere in previous Maseches. Debei Rabbi Shila Amre Mavliga. Another type of tree. We don't even know what it is. But Amre La Zu Golmish. Some unfortunately to explain this. But Amre La Zu Golmish, that some say that it's a different type of tree. Pliga de Rabbi Bar Huna, because up until now we said that there's only 4 types of cedar. But the Amar Rabbi Bar Huna, Amar Bei Rav, Asara Mini Arazimim. Really, there are 10. What's the Mari Makom for this? Shenemar, the pasuk reads, Etin Bamidbar Erez, Shita Bahadas Ve'etz Shemen, Osim Ba'arava Berosh Tidhar, Us Ashur Yachdav. That is what the pasuk references. Erez Arza. The word Erez refers to a regular cedar tree. Shita is Tornisa. That's a pine tree. Hadas is Asa. That's myrtle. That's what we're used to from the Hadassim and Aravos. Eitz Shemen is a Parsima. That is a balsam tree. Berosh is Barta. That is a boxwood tree. Tidhar is Shaga. That's a fir tree. To be spelled properly, not F-U-R, but F-I-R, a fir tree. Ta'ashur is Shorivna, unclear in the Meforshim what this is. And the Gemara says, so therefore we have 10. Says the Gemara, you can't count. That was not 10. That was 7. Says the Gemara, Hani Shiva Habu. So says the Gemara, 2 different versions of how we get to 10. We're just about halfway down. Ki asa Rabdimi Amar, Hosifo Alem, Alonim, Almonim, and Almogim. 3 other trees were added. These 3, what are these? Alonim is Butmi. This is an elm tree. Almonin is Beluti, this is an oak tree, and Almugan is Ksisa. This is actually talking about coral, like the one that grows in the water. We'll hear a story about that later, but it was talking about that type of tree, that these are of the many types of quote-unquote cedar. Obviously, coral is not cedar. So again, to the theory, we're not really speaking about cedar options and the various split hairs of what cedar tree is, because the cedar tree doesn't have coral in its phylum or in its kingdom at all. Totally different. Some say that the extra 3 were a little different. They're not, as we saw a couple of lines ago, of Alonim and Almonim and Almogin, but rather Aronim, Armonim and Almogin. Aronim is Are, that's talking about the tree called laurel. Armonim is Duli, which is a chestnut tree, and Almugin is Ksisa. This one they agree to, which is the corals. Says the Gemara, wait 1 second. The pasuk reads, "V'tzi adir lo ya'avrenu," that when there's the flowing water in the Beis Hamikdash, atzi adir lo ya'avrenu, nothing can cross the flowing water that will emanate from the Beis Hamikdash. Remember, we learned this, that the water that leaves the Beis Hamikdash in different rates, in different volumes. We learned about this earlier in Maseches Yoma, I believe, or maybe in Sukkah, probably in Sukkah. So says the Gemara, what are we talking about? V'tzi adir. Says the Gemara, Amarav zebor nigdol. It's a very large boat. Says the Gemara, Heichi Avdu. What was done with this boat? Says the Gemara, 2 different versions of how the staffing was done. If you can imagine this number of people, Maisu shis alfei gavre. There were 6,000 men, B'tresar Yarche Shata, that worked for 12 months out of the year. V'amre, some reverse it. Tresar Alfe Gabre, 12,000 men, B'shisa Yarche Shata, and they worked for 6 months at a time. The Tane Lachala Ad Shachna. They would take this big boat and they would laden it with sand, and they would add, sand can be pretty dense. That's right. One of the many reasons we use sandbags when there's flooding, also because it conforms to whatever shape it is, so it can help to stop water. So that's what they did. So they would take sand, they'd put sand in the boat until the boat would begin to sink. Buoyancy is somewhat dependent on weight. The nachis bar amurai, then they'd have someone who knew how to swim. We would call this someone who knows how to dive, a diver of some kind. The katar atune de kitna, and they would tie the bottom of the coral bikisisa, the bottom of the coral. The katar la, they would tie it bisfinta, and they tie it up to the boat. And then what they would do is vinlat lechala bishadu livroi. Then they take the sandbags, which they put inside the boat to weigh it down to lower the bottom of the boat closer to the bottom of the floor of the river. And then what they would do is vishadu livroi. They take the sandbags, they throw them overboard, and slowly but surely bekama demidlia akro masya. Slowly but surely the boat would raise its height from the water, and it would tear the coral out, and then the coral would float to the top because coral is less dense than water, so it would easily float. Fine. Now, this was considered to be, just precious cargo. Everyone was very excited to have this because umachlif al-chad trained bekaspa. The ratios, again, we don't have exact weights here, but it traded with silver in a ratio of 1 to 2. The coral seemed to have a greater value sometimes we see this. There are precious metals and precious stones that if you held them in your hand and close your eyes, you wouldn't even know you were holding anything, but they could cost $50,000. Just depends on supply and demand and the precious commodities and the rarities therein. So here we have coral, which apparently was very, very pricey. And it's I guess in similar volume or weight, one of the two. Its ratio was 1 piece of coral to 2 pieces of silver. Where this was done at one of the ports, Tlas Parvisa Habia, and there were 3 ports. Parvisa, Rashi here in the old version of French, Rashi here says Porta, that this was actually considered a port, and that's where the word comes from. So it should be no surprise that it's similar to our language now. And Tarte Be Romai, 2 of them belong to the Romans. According to some, it's not the Romans, but it's the Armenians, just depending on the time of history. V'chada de Be Parsai, and one of them belonged to the Persians. The Be Romai Maskan Ksisa, the one of the Romans is the one where they were dealing with coral. That's Ksisa. The Be Parsai Maskan Marginiasa, and by the port of the Persians, that's where they were dealing, where they were starting to mine pearls. Mikaria Parvisa de Mashmehig. That was the name of the port, is Mashmehig, which means the kingdom of. Rashi here says the same thing, 5 lines from the bottom. Dibur Hamaskal Makaria Parvisa de Mashmehig Osa Shel Parsim Nikres Namal Shel Malucha, the port of the king. So again, just different languages of what these places are called. Let's learn a bunch of comments of Rabbi Yochanan, one after the next. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Kol Shita v'Shita Shenat L'Nachem Yerushalayim. Any piece of wood that was taken out of Yerushalayim, Asir HaKadosh Baruch Hu La'achziran La. Soon in due time, Hashem will return all of that wood to Yerushalayim. Shneimar Etein B'Midbar Eres Shita. We're going to bring it back to Midbar. What's Midbar? Ve'ein Midbar Ela Yerushalayim. And whenever we say Midbar, or often when we say Midbar, it's a reference to Yerushalayim. How do we know that? Shneimar Tzion Midbar Hayasa. That the reference to Tzion is that it is a Midbar. That's comment number 1. Comment number 2. Anyone who learns Torah but doesn't teach it, is similar to a person who is similar to a hadas, to a myrtle branch, which smells great, but it's in the middle of nowhere, which no one can benefit from. If you have Torah, you should be sharing it. You don't have to be a Talmud Chacham, and I can prove you don't have to be a Talmud Chacham because of the next line. Ika de Amre, some say, Kol halome Torah malamda b'makom she'ein Talmud Chacham. Look at the language. Anyone who learns Torah and they teach it in a place where there is no Talmud Chacham, which means you don't have to be a Talmud Chacham to teach Torah. You just have to be able to understand a little bit and teach it to other people. You don't have to. This one, when I started teaching as a Rebbe in the Torah, I got this advice and soon gave this advice. Teachers who were so nervous to teach kids, comment number 1, you know so much more than them. You might not be a Greis Talmud Chacham. You don't need to be. You need to know more than they do and have better midos than they do. And that's it. Then that makes you into a role model. Same idea is quoted here, that Kol Halome Torah, anyone who learns Torah Malamda and teaches it to others, b'makom she'em Talmud Chacham, when there is no Rebbe to teach it otherwise, Doma lehadas b'midbar dechabib. It's similar to someone stumbling upon a hadas. You're the hadas. It smells good. People see that there's something beautiful on your lips. You're teaching Torah. And that is the comparison of the Gemara. Third comment. By the non-Jews, by the Ovdei Kochavim, those who worship the Kochavim and Mazalos, there is no takana. This is speaking specifically for those who took the lives of Yidden. I can always replace their nechoshes with zav. And instead of their barzal, I can bring money, silver. All of their things that they take, I can replace as Hashem. Tachas Rabbi Akiva v'chaverav, my meviin. What about the people they killed? The Asara Harugei Malchus. What about the guy that kills the Yid? Says the Gemara, V'aleim hu omer v'ni kesi damam loni kesi, famous from Avaracham on Shabbos, that we cannot clean them from the blood that they have spilled. They do not have a pleasant afterlife, as it were. Says the Gemara on the very bottom line of Chav Gimel Amud Aleph. We're going to go to the top line of Chav Daled Amud Aleph. One more Amud to go. Says the Gemara, "My umeayin hayu masin masuos." As we said, mi beis belatin. What is beis belatin? My beis belatin. Turning to the top of Chav Gimel Amud Beis Amarav, zu biram. What's biram? Says Tosfos, top of the page. Dibra hamaschel zu biram mashmakan shehume Eretz Yisrael. Again, some of these locations were difficult even for the Rishonim to determine. So Tosa says, I'm pretty sure this wasn't Eretz Yisrael. So that's a reference in Bar Malcolm that indicates that Biram was in Eretz Yisrael. My Gola, if we were to look back in our Mishnah on the bottom of Chav Beis and Beis, it would say that a person would stay on that very last mountain of Beis Belatin until until Shehayaroa Kol HaGola Lefana. What is Gola? So that's the top of Chav Gimel Lamed Beis, my Gola. Amar Rav Yosef Zo Pumpedisa. He would stand on Beis Balatin until he saw fires across the landscape of Pumpedisa. My Kimaduras Eish. Why does the Mishnah say that the fires have to be like a torch? Because Tana, what would happen in that city in Pumbedisa is Kol Echad Ve'echad No Telavuka Biyadav Ola the Rosh Gago. Everyone would go. Could you imagine the scene? Everyone would go on their roof with a torch when it was Rosh Chodesh and hold up a torch. The whole city of Pumbedisa, all the rooftops. Everyone was. It was probably a gorgeous scene to see from Yerushalayim or from that last Beis Balatin, however far they could see. Pumbedisa, I think I learned this once. You could probably correct this. That with the curvature of the Earth, you can only see 7 miles until the Earth curves enough, something like that.
7 miles away.
Right, 7 miles until the curvature of the Earth doesn't. But that's if you're on the ground. If you're on a mountain, you can see further. Your angle changes. But if you're on the ground, yeah, it's not, we use your shiny head right there. We'll just it's fine. We can. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. It's the only sphere I see in the room that's actually revealed. So that's what the Gemara indicates, is that they were able to see a whole city of people that were able to. It's just a gorgeous scene. You know, sometimes in concerts they tell everyone turn on your flashlights on your phone. Lahavdil, lahavdil, lahavdil. But you could imagine such a gorgeous scene of people with, with these just torches on their roofs just to represent. It's probably a beautiful thing. It's the third line down. Tanya, Reb Shimon ben Elazar Omer, we're missing things. We have more information than this. There's more mountains than the ones listed in our Mishnah. More mountains. Some say that these mountains were among the list of the ones that we just discussed, interspersed within the list that we saw in our Mishnah on the bottom of Chav Beis and Mid Beis. And they were facing the other direction, going eastbound, away into the Jordan plains, whatever that were to be, away from Eretz Yisrael, going back toward the other side of the country. So says the Gemara, Mar Chashiv Dahaigi. So Mar Chashiv Dahaigi is just different shitas as to where these mountains were. Clearly, the names were not names that we could identify. We didn't know exactly where they were because, again, these are brisas. It says Tanya. It says Tanya. Even in the times of the Tanaim, we did not know where these mountains were. That's really surprising. It wasn't that far after the Churban. The Tanaim ended in the year 220. That's only 150 years after the Churban. And the Brisas were telling us we don't know what these locations are. So all of the conquests and all of the conquering and the redrawing of the lines, there was so much going on that we lost the names of the cities and mountains. We don't even know what it is anymore. My father's from a city in Poland called Trzin. It's not even on the map anymore. The lines changed so many times. The cities have changed. It's not a city anymore. Same exact thing happened here, but a long time ago in another place. Next comment of Rabbi Yochanan, 8 lines down. Chav Gimel Amud Beis. Rabbi Yochanan, bein kol achas ve'achas shmona parsos. There was 8 parsa in between every mountain. Kama havalahu. Do the math. Tlasin v'tartain. So that means if you do the math, there's 8 in between every one of these 4. That's only 32. Says the Gemara, we know it's further than that. We know that now that it's a longer trip. Says the Gemara, it depends. As the crow flies, it's in fact that distance. But because that's not the way the roads work, they're twisty and windy, so therefore it's longer. The roads have been blocked off. Tichsiv, as the pasuk writes, and another pasuk, Rav Nachman, that my roads have been twisted. Anyways, it really wasn't that far as it relates to the mountain. Again, I know it's hard to know exactly from the Gemara from what place to what place we're measuring, but it wasn't that far. And the reason why it felt longer was because it was not directly point A to B with a straight line. You had to go down the mountain, you had to wrap around the mountains, whatever the case may be. This brings us to a new Mishnah, a quarter of the way down. Chav Gimel Amud Beis. Let's continue. There was a very large Chatzer that was in Yerushalayim, Beis Yazik Chaysen Nikres, that was the name of it, Beis Yazik. And what happened in this place? That's where all the Eidim went when they went to go be when they went to go give Edus on the new month. Ulasham Kol HaEdim Miskansin. Everyone would go there. Bezdin Botkin Osam Sham. All of the Batei Din, the Bezdin would assess all of the people and their Edus in that location. Usudos Kedolos Sosalam, big meals Bishvil Sheyuhu Regilin Lavo. That's how you get people. Always have food. So that's what the Gemara says, is that in the times of the Beis HaMikdash, when they were doing Kiddush HaChodesh al Piriyah with Eidim, they would always have carving stations, they'd have hors d'oeuvres, serving people right and left. They wanted people to always be motivated to come show up. And that's a great motivator. Not much has changed. That's absolutely right. It's a beautiful thing.
Did
That's right. We do kiruv through the stomach, as they say. So says the Gemara, a third of the way down, still in the midst of this Mishnah, 5 lines into the Mishnah, Barishona, originally, says the Gemara, a very unique spin on this halacha, lo zazin misham kol hayom. They weren't allowed to go anywhere. Why? Because yes, it was permissible to break the Isra of Tchum Shabbos to get there. But once you got there, you maxed out and you couldn't leave. That Chatzar was your Daled Amos, you couldn't go anywhere. But then everything changed because Hiskin Rabban Gamliel Azaken Shumahalchan Alpayim Amal Chol Ruach. He says, no, that is not the way things work. You get a fresh Alpayim Amma. Why? Because it was mutter when you left your Alpayim Amma. It's otherwise usher, but you had a pasuk in Chumash to indicate that you're allowed to do the Kiddush HaChodesh and you should be breaking the Tchum Shabbos. V'lo elu bilvad. Not only that, says Michael, if you have a midwife who is trained, a doula who's trained in delivering children, she leaves her tchum to deliver a child, pashat that's mutter because it's pikuach nefashos. Once she gets there, she gets her 2,000 amos. Firemen, they're coming to save people from a fire. Umina gayas from the troops. Umina nahar from waters. Umina mapolis from a falling building. Everyone who has a reason to be there, a halachically valid reason to be there, they get a new and fresh 2,000 amos. End of the Mishnah. The Gemara opens halfway down. How do we spell the word yazik? Beis yazik with an ayin tanan. Oh, beis yazik without an ayin tanan. The ma'inaf kamina. So it says the Gemara, do we say Beis Yazik Tnan Lishna Me'alyu? It's a wonderful language. The pasuk writes, Vayaz Kehu, which is to dig out, Vayasala Kehu, and they were destoning a particular area to make it livable. So that's a positive terminology. O Dilma Beis Yazik without the Ayin Tnan Lishna Detzarahu, which is a bad thing. Kidchsi V'hu Asur Ba'azikim, and that's a reference to chains. Just an interesting halachic side. The Shulchan Aruch writes that if a chazan doesn't distinguish between an aleph and an ayin, they should not be a chazan. So this is not so simple. Most people don't do that. I don't know of many. I only know of one person who really does a good job of this. One of the Shoshan brothers, who's an old-time Chicagoan. Every time you hear him daven, all of his ayins are ayins, and all of his alephs are soft. That is how it's supposed to be. The ayin is a guttural letter, so that there are halachic nafkaminas. Like let's say, for example, you say Yaakov or Yaakov. Those are different words. And is it worth correcting a chazan? Good shaila. I don't know about not a chazan, but about koreh. Those are good shailas. We Ashkenazim Paskin and Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah that the only mistakes that we correct for are mistakes that change the definition of a word. But if they don't change the definition of a word, so then we don't change them. So it's very hard with bar mitzvah boys because, first of all, it's just hard for them in general. And second of all, they're not Bakim and Diktuk. And if their teacher isn't a Baki and Diktuk, they're in big trouble. So these are big shilas. It's not simple. It's not simple. We have an obligation to hear laning, and not everyone is ru'uya l'kach to lane. It's not so simple. Okay, so which one is it? Do we say it's ya'azek with an ayin or yazek without? So it says the Gemara 2/3 of the way down. Amar Abaye, toward the end of this section of the Gemara, toward the next Mishnah, Tashma. Maybe we have a raya. Seudos gedolos hayu osalem sham k'deshu regilim lavo. It's a beautiful day. Everything is positive. Maybe we should assume that it's with an ayin because we said that word was a lishna ma'al yehu denaka. Good. So it says the Gemara, no. According to the Tanakama, there's one good thing and one bad thing. Yes, you've got carving stations, but no, you don't have 2,000 amos. You're trapped. So we don't really know which language is correct. Next Mishnah, case at Bodkines ha'edim. How do we check the edim? Or I should say, how does Bezin check the edim? Says the Gemara, Zuk sheba barishon. You get in line. You're the first edim to get there. You get to go first. So then, of them, Bodkino Sorishon, that pair gets checked first, but they check them one at a time. The older one goes in first in order to get grilled, to get interrogated first. Lo. Emor, tell us, Ketzad Roisis Halavana, how did the moon appear? Lifnei Hachama or La'achar Hachama? Tough question. Was the crescent of the moon, was the concave side, the side that's rounded out, facing the sun, or was the crescent the other way? Was the sun facing the inside of the crescent, which is impossible? Let's phone Oladroma. Was it to the north or was it to the south? Kama haya gavoa. How far off the horizon was it? Ula'ain haya nota. Which way was the moon leaning in its curvature? Right? In which way was the moon spinning? The kama haya rachav. How wide was it? Imamar lifnei achama lo amar klum. So this is actually obvious if just with very basic understanding. If this is the sun and this is the moon, this is impossible. Because what does the sun do? It reflects off the moon. By definition, You can't have the crescent be this way and the moon be here, because the sun pushes its light onto, this is impossible. So if somebody says the sun is right here, but the C-shaped crescent was open toward the moon, they're lying. That is impossible. You can't have that because the sun shines off the moon. It has to be that the side that you'll see of the moon, the crescent has to be this way. So that's why the Gemara says, the Mishnah says, this is one of the, it's a trick question. Like, what was it, C-shaped facing the moon, facing the sun, or was the back of the sea? No, that just means you're an Am Haaretz. Astronomically and halachically, because there's no way that that's even remotely possible. So that's one of the questions, and that's why the Mishnah says that if you say lifnei hachama, that the crescent was open to the sun, you don't know what you're talking about. Lo amar klum. They throw you right out the door. You're done. After they finish with the first guy, assuming that he passes muster, they bring in his second aid. They'd ask him the same questions. If everyone agrees with one another, the edus of aid 1 and the edus of aid 2 within the first pair all agree. Edusan kayemes, and then they don't need anybody else. Dozens of people showed up. Ushar kol azugos. Just to be polite, son Rosh, tell me what you saw. Schmooze a little bit, but really we didn't need them. We already got our edus. How many times do you need Edom to testify? We're done already. Says the Gemara, we already have. We don't want people to be downtrodden, that we schlepped them all the way out from wherever they came from. They're sitting in this field, and according to the Tanakama, they're trapped in this little chutzner for the rest of the day. They can't go anywhere, and we don't want to have that experience. We want people to come and show up. So I would imagine that by the time people got close, people started running. You know, like you want to be the first in line. You want your ages to be the machriya. You don't want to sit there in the back. And if you're really just wanted to chop a rind and just sit there for the shmorg, and fine, that's fine. That's what the Gemara says. Then the Gemara makes a strange presumption. And the Gemara asks, hey, 1 second. You said in the Mishnah that there are two questions you ask. You ask, was it lifnei hachama or was it la'achar hachama? But that should be similar to is the sun tzvona or is the sun droma? So it says the Gemara, Hainu lifnei hachama, hainu litzvona. The first question of lifnei hachama is just as bad as saying that the sun is in the northern part of the sky. And hainu la'achar hachama, hainu lidroma. These two questions are both klutz kashas. Why? Because we live north of the equator. So if we live north of the equator, from our perspective, the sun always goes south when it comes up. So let's say east and west, south. So then if this is east and west, so the sun does not go straight overhead, only by the equator. Where we live, because we're north of the equator, the sun goes up away from us to the south and comes back, and the moon will trail. So if the guy says the moon was in the north, come on, you don't even know what you're talking about. That's impossible. For where you live, so these are two klutz kashas in a row. So says the Gemara, both of these questions are impossible. Hainu lifnei hachama, if you want to say that the C shape of the moon was open to the sun, which is impossible, that's the same thing as saying that the sun went the other way, went to the north. You don't live there. That's it. You don't live south of the equator. That's impossible. And therefore you have to be wrong. So says the Gemara, Hainu lifnei hachama, hainu litzvona, hainu la'achar hachama, hainu lidroma. Both of these are klutz kashas. Amar Rabbi, no, pigimasa lifnei hachama, o la'achar hachama. We want to know, we just want to know, really, they're separate questions. It could be that north and south is north and south of the point that we expected it to be, but lav dafka, like mamish north of the equator. Like that obviously wouldn't make any sense. So Amar Rabbi pigimasa lifnei hachama la'achar hachama, imamar lifnei hachama lo amar klum. That we know, and we know scientifically that's true, but we also have a pasuk to indicate as much. So how do we know this? Amar Rav Yochanan, my dichsiv, what does the pasuk mean when it says Hamshel v'fachad imo oseh shalom bimromav? What does this mean? Hamshel v'fachad imo, that there's going to be a pachad with it, and it'll do peace in the miromim up in the heavens. Says the Gemara, me'olam lo ra'asa chama pigi masa shalavana. The moon would never see the flaw, quote unquote, meaning the shaded side of the moon, of course, because of the science shebo, but also because of the pasuk. V'lo pigi masa shel keshes, and as well, the sun would never be able to access the inside of a rainbow. So if there's a rainbow that's shaped like this, wherever it is in the sky, the sun would never be underneath it. That doesn't ever happen. again, scientifically, but as well because of the pasuk. Pigi masa shalavana. Why is it that Hashem set up the world this way? Because we want to make sure the chol shadaita. We know that the moon had a rough time being degraded from shnei meoros hagadolim to meor hagadol and meor hakatan. Fine, and not only that, pigi masa shal keshes delolim ro'ovdei kochavim gire ka mashtia. That according to some different pshatim here in the Gemara, that some say that the rainbow, when it's turned on its side in a semicircle, and if it's facing the sun, then it's as if you're pulling back a bow to shoot arrows. That's gire, is that we're shooting arrows here, and we're afraid. Rashi seems to have a little bit of a different shot. I don't know, but what I saw in some of the Meforshim was not this way. But the way that I learned it was not like Rashi, but that it looked like you're pulling a bow, and that would not be the right way to look at it. We're going to stop here. We'll pick up on Chav Daled and Amud Aleph tomorrow, and wishing you all a beautiful night.